to talk about more of a serious topic today, and be prepared. This is going to be a longer video than I usually do because I've got a lot to cover and I really want to make sure I have the time to fully articulate my thoughts on it and say exactly what I want to say on the topic, because I'm very passionate about the topic we're going to talk about today. Also, fair warning, it does just a little bit, just a tiny bit have to do with politics, because it started when I saw this article from the New York Times, how people of color inside the Buttigieg campaign sought to be heard. Now, full disclosure, I am actually a Buttigieg supporter. I have been for a long time. I have given money to his campaign. I've met him. I've met his husband. I've talked to both of them. He is one of the people that is in the running for my vote in the New Hampshire primary. I'm very lucky I live in New Hampshire. I get really, we're spoiled when it comes to this stuff if you're into this sort of thing. So I do think that he's a good person. I do think that he's a good candidate, and he might get my vote. I'm not 100% yet, but he might. But I saw this report come out, and it actually has to do with the way that he's running his campaign more than anything else that really caught my attention. In early December, more than 100 staff members of Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign staff gathered at the South Bend City Church, a mile from headquarters, for a mandatory half-day retreat about diversity and inclusion. Less than 2 months remained before the start of voting, a time when most campaigns are focused on full-time politics. Buttigieg advisors say the retreat was part of an ongoing effort to foster a progressive culture that empowered employees of color. For some of those staff members, however, the workplace itself was a problem, and working for a candidate with so little support from the Black and Hispanic voters had become demoralizing. In interviews, current and former staff members of color said they believed that senior Buttigieg officials didn't listen to their concerns and ideas about the campaign. One said there was a daily emotional weight on people of color who felt that they were employed in order to help the campaign meet its ambitious diversity targets. And some Hispanic employees said that managers asked them to translate text even if they didn't speak Spanish, making them feel disrespected. One of Buttigieg's biggest challenges has been to broaden his appeal beyond his overwhelmingly white base of voters, but he has yet to make significant gains, and his staff members have spent time wrestling with their own interpersonal relations in the workplace. A follow-up meeting nearly 2 weeks after the retreat, organized by staff members and attended by about 70 people, became emotional, according to 2 people who were present. Some employees of color spoke about feelings of being disrespected by white colleagues. Others said that they were stressed from having to answer questions from friends and family members about working for a candidate struggling with minority voters. At a second meeting on January 2nd featured lengthy discussions of the importance of diversity in hiring and sometimes tearful descriptions of the difficulty of recruiting people of color to the staff. I'm just going to stop there. Pete Buttigieg's campaign is based out of South Bend, Indiana. Of course, they're going to have trouble recruiting people of color to the staff. I think the concerns here are much broader about once they join the staff, how are they treated? One employee recalled a troubling incident for staff members of color. The campaign had planned a fundraiser with a donor who had helped try to suppress the release of a video showing the police shooting of a Black Chicago teenager. Some members of the vetting team had warned against doing the fundraiser with the donor as a co-host. Campaign fundraising officials proceeded anyway, and at the last minute, amid an outcry, were forced to remove the donor as co-host and return his donation. The Buttigieg campaign focuses on staff diversity, resembles, on one level, efforts found at many organizations. But most campaigns are fast-growing and fast-moving enterprises that rarely have time or money for in-depth workplace assessments or extensive inclusion and training programs. That is patently untrue. You know how I know? Because the Buttigieg campaign a while ago hired I think 2 deputy leadership development people. They have people on staff specifically focused on training their employees to have real world skills. I know this, A, because I applied for the position and I didn't get it. They really should have hired me for reasons that we're going to talk about, but whatever. I mean, it was not meant to be in this scenario. But I actually talked to Pete Buttigieg's campaign manager, Mike Schmuel, I think I'm pronouncing that right, when he visited the Nashua campaign office, and I asked him what his intention for these positions were, and he said, we really want to make sure that people working on the campaign are able to develop real-world skills that they can apply afterwards. So they have people actually working on this stuff, and they have for a very, very long time. Now, the little tiny bit about at least one person they hired, again, and I think they hired 2. I'm not 100% sure based on what I've seen, but the people that they hired were not actually professional trainers like I am. This is why I say they should have hired me, or someone like me anyway. They're political operatives that have worked on other campaigns. So I don't know how serious they really were about that effort if they're creating these positions and then they're not actually filling them with qualified people that have, done this in the real world. They're filling them with campaign operatives that have worked on other campaigns. That doesn't really make sense to me. But I will say that to say that they didn't have the resources to do it, absolutely false. They had at least 2 people, and that's more than a lot of organizations have that are much, much larger. Okay. The situation at Buttigieg's headquarters with a couple dozen of employees expressing frustrations also stands out as unusual because of the unique set of pressures on a campaign and a candidate trying to become a trusted voice on matters of race. Interviews with half a dozen current and former staff members and a review of internal documents, emails, and the recording shows how the campaign and its employees grappled with goals and grievances related to diversity. Those interviewed insisted on anonymity, citing non-disclosure agreements or fear of retribution. In addition, the Buttigieg campaign made other employees available to discuss the handling of workplace issues. In a statement, Mr. Buttigieg, 38, who recently nodded to these challenges and struck a progressive tone, and then we get a nice little PR spinny statement, blah, blah, blah. The accounting director for the campaign, who was made available by officials, said that because of Mr. Buttigieg's struggle to attract Black voters, the campaign had to meet a high bar internally in addressing the concerns of minority employees. We can't just be good enough on these issues. Our candidates and our team. We can't just be good enough on these issues. Our candidates and our teams. Mr. Geyer, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, I'm sorry, who is Black, said in an interview. He said he was a member of what the campaign called bridge groups, aimed at providing support to staff who were members of certain affinity groups, including Black and LGBTQ employees. He said the group had conveyed some of his frustrations to the campaign manager, Mike Schmuel, who took time to listen. He declined to comment about the specific frustrations. Well, that seems very controlled, but I mean, their campaign is very, very controlled. Pete Buttigieg is a Capricorn, through and through, if you believe in that stuff, and I tend to, but through and through, that's a very controlled thing, and I'm not sure that's actually giving us real answers here. But what I really want to get to in this is, let me just see, I don't want to read this whole article. So what caught my attention about this was actually this survey that they did. On January 1st, the campaign's national engagement coordinator, Raven Collins, circulated a survey soliciting examples of microaggressions in the workplace, asking that only people of color complete it. The first question asks whether employees of color had experienced any of 6 microaggressions from a white colleague, a list that included being interrupted, being called the name of a different staff member of color. Miss Hollins declined to comment. Now, here's where you start to lose me a little bit. I am completely in favor of strategic, thought-through initiatives to enhance diversity and inclusion in organizations, make sure every single person, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of their background, regardless of anything, is treated fairly, with humanity, and has access to every single opportunity that every other person has access to. I am completely in favor of these things. There are wonderful people doing wonderful work in the diversity and inclusion space. What bothers me, and this is where I'm going to start getting heated, is this focus on microaggressions. And there are very legitimate reasons why this bothers me. And it's not just the Buttigieg campaign. This is something that in the circles I run in human resources and different organizations, different, professional circles that I run in, the term microaggressions has been popping up more and more and more and more and more. And it's been given more energy and attention by individuals. Now, I fundamentally believe that the people that are focusing on this are trying to do the right thing. I really do. I fundamentally believe they are trying to do the right thing. They are trying to be good people. They are trying to help and support their staff. They're trying to make these more inclusive environments. I believe they have positive intent with what they're doing. But when workplaces focus on microaggressions, not only are they dropping the ball on things that are much more damaging, and we're going to talk about those later in the video, but they are also putting their staff in a really disempowering position. It is incredibly disempowering over the long term to feed these concerns about microaggressions. Now, what do I mean about microaggressions? Well, let's look at this article in the Washington Post. The war on microaggressions. Has it created a victimhood culture on campuses? Now, this is going to focus on colleges, but keep in mind, listen, the Buttigieg campaign is made up of kids. They're not kids. I shouldn't call them kids. I'm getting older every day, and I feel like I'm sure people, my age can relate to this. Everyone younger than me is now a kid. But they're younger people. They're people just out of college. Those are the type of people that can join these campaigns. They make no money. They live in someone else's house. They don't have, stuff that they're lugging around with them from state to state. They're younger people. So when we're talking about campuses, keep in mind, people are coming from campuses and going directly into things like this. This is also translating into what we're starting to see from young professionals in the workplace. They're taking these sensibilities that they learned on college campuses, and it's starting to infiltrate the workplace, and it is not to their benefit. Absolutely not. Let's see what this article says. Larry Mantle, a radio host in California, was moderating a discussion last month at UC Irvine on the fraught subject of microaggressions. Words that, though uttered innocently by white people, are said to deeply offend those who are less privileged when he made a big mistake. He called on his first questioner and he asked, "Where are you from?" That's a standard question for talk show hosts, but the audience froze in silence, briefly and uncomfortably before breaking into nervous laughter. Katrina, the questioner, explained, "People are laughing because of the question," she said. But she forgave Mantle. "I don't take offense to that," she said, "because I'm part of the privileged majority who don't constantly have to put up with questions of where I am from." The reason "where are you from" was considered offensive by some was explained on the list of microaggression guidelines, a tool for recognizing microaggressions provided by the University of California to be used in seminars to educate faculty members, that was the subject of Mantle's radio discussion. And oh, listen, I just clicked on that link. How funny is this? File not found. I don't know what that means, but we'll go back to the article. And this article, by the way, it's a little bit older. It's 2015. So I'm going to, listen, files on the internet change. I'm not going to knock them too badly for that. But let's look at this screen grab from it. Tool, recognizing the microaggressions and the messages they sent. Microaggressions are everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostilatory, derogatory, or negative messages to targets of persons solely based on their marginalized group membership. The first step in addressing microaggressions is to recognize that when a microaggression has occurred and what message it may be sending. The context of their relationship and the situation is critical. And, then it goes into different themes. Asking someone of color or any minority, "Where are you from?" or "Where are you born?" the guideline suggests, could send the message that you are not a true American. You're a perpetual foreigner in your own country. The same for comments like, "You speak English very well," and "Where are you from?" and "You look so interesting." Saying to an African American, "When I look at you, I don't see color," is kind of a color blindness that denies the individual as a racial/cultural being. Once kids were taught about sticks and stones, which breaks their bones, but that words will never hurt me. Now, on some campuses, they and faculty are are being taught the opposite. Innocently uttered words can and do hurt, and speech codes and guidelines about what to say, what and what not to say are all the rage. The latest controversy is also at the UC system, where the Board of Regents is considering whether saying that Israel has no right to exist or that Israel is mostly to blame for troubles in the region is a form of anti-Semitism worthy of being placed on the offensive language list. The debate over hurtful words and microaggressions, what can be said and what shouldn't be said, has been roiling campuses across California, as well as places like Oberlin, Wesleyan, Ithaca, and Columbia, and elsewhere for several years now, complete with the microaggression blogs reserved strictly for those who are not privileged, meaning white people, in which the offended call out the offenders for any number of perceived microaggressions defined in the proposed UC tool as everyday verbal, and I think we read this, everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative messages to persons based solely on their marginalized group membership. To critics, this is all petty and worse, stifling, and when supported by state university administrators, very much an imposition on free speech. This concept is now being used to suppress not just, say, personal insults or discrimination in hiring or grading, but also ideas that UC wants to exclude from university classrooms. Fighting microaggressions has become a cottage industry in academia. So I think what I wanted to get out of this one, I don't want to keep reading this article, but what I wanted to get out of this was just a basic idea of what microaggressions are, to their insults based on, membership in a marginalized group of some sort, whether they're intentional or unintentional. Now, the reason I wanted to find this, let's go back and look at this Buttigieg article. In their survey out to their employees. And it says, make it a little bit bigger, please only fill out this survey if you identify as a person of color. The answers are anonymous and will be used to inform our white colleagues about privilege and microaggressions. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. In the workplace, have you ever experienced the following from a white colleague? Been interrupted / talked over, left off a relevant email chain, not invited to a meeting directly related to your job, idea was ignored / dismissed without explanation, someone taking credit for your ideas or insights even accidentally, being called the name of a different staff member of color, all of the above or other. And then they have some open-ended questions on the other side. Now here's the problem I have with this. I don't much worry about some of the more overt forms of microaggressions they're talking about. And what I mean by that is, like, I'm not criticizing those. I think that it is relevant to keep these things in mind. Asking someone, kind of trying to make the impression that, someone's a foreigner, or, making different assumptions based on the race of the person or the gender of the person or the ability of the person. I think that those are fair to call into question and to be, basically be told in the workplace. Again, I'm going to bring this back to a workplace environment. Hey, cut it out. Like, not cool. Don't say that stuff. I think that is completely fair game. I do believe people should receive, some training, probably as part of a larger initiative on those things if it's a problem in your organization. That's not what their campaign is surveying about. That's not. And this is where it crosses into the line of being very, very murky for me, of creating perpetual victims in organizations. Now, I just want you to think about this. I don't know, person watching this video right now, I don't know what race you are, I don't know what gender you are, I don't know anything about you, okay? Have you ever been interrupted and talked over in a meeting? Yes. Have you ever been left off a relevant email chain? Yes. Have you ever been not invited to a meeting directly related to your job? Yes. Have you ever had an idea ignored or dismissed without explanation? Yes. Have you ever had someone else take credit for your idea or insight, even accidentally? Yes. I'm even going to add one to this list because they've got the other column. Have you ever had someone mispronounce your name over and over again? Yes. Yes, yes, yes. My name is near impossible to pronounce, both my first and last name. And that is actually a microaggression I've seen on lists before, like people having their names mispronounced. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is virtually none of, there's one that I think that I'm kind of okay with, having been called the name of a different staff member of color. I'm not including that in the assessment I'm about to make. Every single one of these other things, though, this happens to everyone. This literally happens to everyone in every work environment ever. Every single person in their career are going to experience these things. Are we going to do training around those things every single time someone experiences one of these things when there is probably zero ill intent involved? Are we going to have these, massive workshops based on these things? Listen, I can't get a lot of organizations to have workshops based on legitimate things. These are not legitimate things to have workshops off of when every single person is going to experience this. Instead of telling people, yes, you are a victim and we're going to go after this person who microaggressed against you and we're going to make sure that they don't do it again, and we're going to put policies in place, we're going to put training in place because you were left off an email. Instead of doing that, what if instead we put together training programs to help people develop their personal empowerment, develop their confidence, develop their ability to assert themselves in these situations so that they are not a victim and can handle the situation themselves? Telling people that they are a victim because they were not invited to a meeting. I'm sorry, what? This probably had nothing to do with your race or your gender or your background. Sometimes people don't get invited to meetings. It is usually completely inadvertent. Or that they were interrupted or talked over. Listen, if you're interrupted and talked over, wouldn't it be great if someone, maybe your organization, provided you with training to be able to assert yourself in a kind, gentle way to make sure you have your voice heard? Wouldn't it be great if your organization trained your boss how to be there and support you through that, and trained your boss on how to coach you to develop that assertiveness and that self-empowerment? Wouldn't that make more sense? Let's look at some other things around microaggressions, though. We might come back to this, but I got a lot more to get through, so I want to keep moving. This is from Scientific America. The science of microaggressions. It's complicated. Subtle a bit, and basically I want to make the argument here. What I'm trying to do is show you that it's not necessarily that I think that every single form of microaggression should be ignored. However, not all of them should be taken seriously. And there are many, 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 frankly, more important things for organizations to focus on that do not include someone feeling offended because they were talked over or not invited to a meeting. The story of racial prejudice in the U.S. over the past several decades is a tale of good and bad news. On the mostly positive side, surveys of the American public suggest that overt prejudice, bias to which people are willing to admit, have been on a steady decline, although some data suggest a slight uptick following the presidential election of Barack Obama. On the negative side, prejudice, even in its ugly forms, is far from eradicated. In the weeks preceding my writing of this column, racial slurs surfaced. Let's see, what is the date on this column? 2017, so it's a little bit old. Surfaced against LeBron James, blah, blah, blah. Against the backdrop of this concept of microaggressions, it has really recently received a flurry of attention. Coined in 1970 by Harvard University psychiatrist Chester Pierce, the term microaggressions refers to subtle or slight or snubs directed towards historically stigmatized individuals, especially minorities. This concept lay largely dormant until 2007, when an influential article by Columbia University counseling psychologist Daryl Wing Su and his co-authors brought it to the attention of a mainstream academic audience. According to Su and his collaborators, the toxicity of microaggression stems largely from their ambiguity. Victims of these often largely invisible but pernicious statements and actions find themselves trapped in a catch-22. If they ignore the microaggression directed their way, they risk becoming the target of future transgressions by the same perpetrators. The term commonly used in the microaggression literature to refer to people who regularly emit such statements and actions. In contrast, if victims accuse perpetrators of aggressing against them, they risk being accused of hypersensitivity or even paranoia. I don't disagree with this statement at all, and this is why I think that personal empowerment training is actually a far more productive way to go about addressing these sort of things, helping your employees to develop their confidence, their assertiveness, helping them to know when to speak up, helping them to communicate their thoughts clearly. Listen, these are things people should learn in college, but they do not. They do not. And some people might argue that this is not the employer's job to teach them these things. Well, you're either going to dedicate resources to constantly battling the unwinnable battle of microaggressions, and I say it's unwinnable because literally anything can be interpreted as a microaggression. Literally anything. Like, let's for example take the idea of like, where are you from being a microaggression. Listen, I'm married to an immigrant. I'm not only married to an immigrant, I'm married to an immigrant who at one point was an illegal immigrant. And we had to go through a whole 4-year process of fighting the government to get him a permanent green card after we got married. You know, buy me a drink sometime if you see me at a conference. I'll tell you all about it if you're really interested. It was a battle. He is thrilled when people ask him where he's from. Maybe not thrilled, but he certainly doesn't take it as an offense because he's not interpreting it in the worst possible way. Or if someone says something to him like, "Oh, your English is so great." Listen, my husband speaks Russian as his first language. He was born in Ukraine. He started learning English when he was a little kid, but he's always been very conscious about his English abilities. I think he speaks beautiful English, but he really, if someone says to him, "You speak English beautifully," he's like, it's like, yep. He's very proud of himself about that. Like, that's interpreting something in the best possible way, as a genuine compliment. Someone could very easily take those things, as we're seeing from these articles, and say, you know, well, you're a foreigner and you don't belong here. I mean, you know, you're taking the exact same sentence and based on the perception of the receiver being interpreted in two different ways. And this is where the problem starts, because with this perspective, literally anything can be a microaggression. And when we start to train people to look for these things, to look for reasons to be offended, and by the way, someone's probably going to accuse me of using a microaggression just then because I said you're looking for reasons to be offended. But when you start to train people to do this, and you actively incentivize doing this, then they're going to start looking for it everywhere. This is not healthy. It is not healthy for them. It is not healthy for their stress levels. It is not healthy for their emotional well-being. It is certainly not healthy for organizations because you're going to start creating all these different interpersonal problems. Listen, again, I really want to emphasize, there are very valid things to be concerned about in some of these statements. There really, really are. I'm not trying to dismiss all of them. But you walk a fine line. You walk a fine line. It's, you know, and it's a difficult line to define. And I think because this is still a relatively new thing, I don't have the answer right now about how to define it exactly. But this is something that people do need to be aware of. And what I don't want to see happen, and again, we're going to talk about why in a little bit, but what I don't want to see happen is people falling into this trap of like, yes, I have to combat every microaggression in my organization. It's going to take your eye off things that are, frankly, much larger problems. And we're going to talk about why they're problems. We're now going to move into more scholarly research about why these things are problematic, to use a favorite word there. Sue and her co-authors contend that each microaggression carries a single implicit message. For example, according to them, the microaggression, "America is a melting pot," communicates to minority individuals to assimilate to the broader culture. This is a perfect example of what I'm saying. How many times have you heard someone say America is a melting pot as like a really beautiful, aspirational idea? Where here it's being interpreted as, you don't belong here. And again, I'm married to an immigrant, okay? I get it. But it's just like, it's all open to interpretation. "You are so articulate" communicates that most minority individuals are inarticulate. I mean, I don't think it does, but, you know, it's all up to interpretation. When encountered frequently over long stretches of time, Sue and colleagues argue microaggressions exert a detrimental impact on recipients, contributing to low self-esteem and, in some cases, clinical levels of depression, anxiety, and mental health problems. Yes, because you have taught them that they are a victim and you haven't given them the tools to empower themselves. You've created a problem where there is some, these things work. These things work when there is just a hint of legitimacy to it. It's kind of like, oh God, I'm really going to get raked over the coals for the example I'm about to make, but I love The Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is like one of my favorite shows of all time. I will sit down and watch any Twilight Zone marathon on the Sci-Fi Channel ever. I think it's great. And the reason that The Twilight Zone is such a great show, and if you've never seen it, you should watch it. But it's such a great show because it has enough truth in it. It has enough truth to really resonate on that deep human level. It is the same thing here. There is enough truth in what they're saying that there are problems with these things going on, and they are problems that should be addressed by, frankly, very experienced professionals who understand the nuance in this area. But that is not to say the whole thing is real. Just like The Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is a sci-fi show. It is not real. It is fiction. It's the same thing here. There is enough truth for people to think that it's a real thing that should be paid attention to, but a lot of what's going on around this right now is not real, and it has not been proven. And I'm going to show you research to show that this has not been proven yet. Might it be someday? Might it be someday that we do more research into this area and we're able to put more structure around it? Yes, absolutely. Workplace bullying has been researched for like 50 years in organizations, and there is a really well-defined framework around it. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But this has not been researched yet. I'm going to show this to you in a second. Actually, let's fast forward down this now. To be clear, Sue and his collaborators deserve credit for helping to bring the prevalence and importance of subtle prejudice to wider public and academic attention. Yes, cosign. But is the microaggression concept grounded in solid science, and is it helpful? It certainly is possible that microaggressions can in some cases be harmful, especially when people are exposed to them repeatedly for years. But we need to study this phenomenon better so that we can encourage difficult conversations, not squelch them. Nevertheless, given the provisional state of the literature, it is all but impossible to determine the degree to which people's reactions to microaggressions are attributable to the stimuli themselves as opposed to people's subjective reactions. This is really important because it requires this tells us how we treat the problem, right? Because if the problem is caused by the stimuli, by what the person said, then you have to go to the person that's speaking the microaggression, right? And you have to say, cut it out. Don't say that. And here's the reasons why you don't say that. However, if the stress and the anxiety and the harm that these microaggressions are causing are caused solely based on the receiver's subjective perceptions or reactions to them, then you can't fix that issue by training people not to say certain things, because nothing you ever say will be good enough. If it's not that, it's going to be another thing. You have to train the receiver to take control of their inner dialogue, their story, what they're telling themselves, and come at it from a much more empowering position. And not for nothing too, but when you teach people to personally empower themselves, listen, this is exactly what my book is about. My book, if you don't know what it is, it's called Zen Your Work. It's all about mindfulness techniques you can use in the workplace. This is exactly what this is about. This is not just about meditating, right? Ooh, I have my sound on my computer. Sorry about that. This is not just about meditating. This is about helping people to personally empower themselves, taking control of their story, making sure that they have the perspective they need to achieve their own personal goals, no matter what anyone else says or does. Right? You have to train for different things based on what the real problem is. And with microaggressions, I would argue that we do not have research to show that this is a problem that is based on what people are saying. We have, in fact, what we are starting to see is that it might be more of a problem of this subjective interpretation. So you have two different solutions here. Now, here's another study. And this, I'm just going to read the abstract, but I think this abstract is important. This is from Perspectives on Psychological Science. It was published in 2017, so pretty recent as far as like academic research goes. The microaggression concept has recently galvanized public discussion and spread to numerous college campuses and businesses. I argue that the microaggression research, MRP, rests on 5 core premises, namely that microaggressions are operationalized with sufficient clarity and consensus to afford rigorous scientific investigation, 2, are interpreted negatively by most or all minority groups, 3, reflect implicitly prejudicial and implicitly aggressive motives, 4, be validly assessed using only respondents' subjective reports, and 5, assert an adverse impact on the recipient's mental health. So this is how he's kind of defining a microaggression, which I think is much more valid than some of these more general statements, at least from a research perspective. And this is what you gotta understand. When you're talking about really understanding these concepts, it's not as simple as throwing out a sentence full of like fancy buzzwords. You have to actually put frameworks around it. You have to put definition around it. A review of the literature reveals negligible support for all 5 suppositions. What this is saying, this is a literature review, and I'm not going to pay the $35 or whatever to access this article. If someone wants to give me $35, I'll do it and I'll do a thing on it. But listen, a review of the literature reveals negative support for all 5 suppositions. That means a review of the current research in this area does not support that we can meet this framework. It does not support that they are operationalized with sufficient clarity and consensus to afford rigorous scientific investigation. It does not support that they are interpreted negatively by most or all minority group members. It does not support that and let's actually talk about number 2. This is important. This is just what I was saying about some things being subjective. Like, this is subjective interpretation. All Black people do not interpret things the same way. All Latino people do not interpret things the same way. All women do not interpret things the same way. All people in wheelchairs do not interpret things the same way. You're taking the interpretations of a few and you're applying them to the broadest group, but it's not necessarily a valid way of looking at it. Number 3, so the literature does not reflect implicitly prejudicial or implicitly aggressive motives. Number 4, the research does not support that it can be validly assessed using only respondents' subjective reports. And 5, the review of the literature is negligible for exerting an adverse effect on the recipient's mental health. This is really important. This is saying that right now, the research does not back up the claims that are being made. And yes, this was 3 years ago now, actually, it's 2020. But research does not progress this quickly in this area. It's not as though we've had any amazing, groundbreaking mountains of evidence that have come forward in the last 3 years. That hasn't happened. It doesn't work that way. Maybe a study or 2 has come out, but really there's not probably going to be enough evidence to dispute this claim, at least right now. Let's keep going. I want to look at more problems with microaggressions. This is from the National Association of Scholars, the pseudoscience of microaggressions. Now, I'm not going to read this whole article, but going down into technical issues. So this is looking at problems with the research that has existed around microaggressions. What things have come up that are not necessarily leading to an accurate analysis of the situation. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. I don't want to cut this video later, so you're going to have to see me drinking soda. All right, technical issues. There are biased interview questions in these studies. Conventional protocol is for researchers to be unbiased in conducting the interview by properly phrasing questions. These race researchers have no problem making it perfectly clear what they intend to show. In their interview protocol, for example, Sue et al., remember this is the person that we were just listening to before that kind of brought microaggressions back, asked their focus group members to respond to the following. What are some subtle ways that people treat you differently because of your race? Describe a situation in which you felt uncomfortable, insulted, or disrespected by a comment that had overt racial overtones. Think of some of the stereotypes that exist about your racial group. Have others subtly expressed the stereotypical beliefs about you? In what ways have others made you feel put down because of your cultural values or communication style? In what ways have people subtly expressed that the white way is the right way? After such prompting by the interviewer, respondents would be more likely to find what the researcher is looking for, i.e., stories of whites committing microaggressions against minority respondents. Another problem, very small number of study respondents. In general, microaggression studies are based on very small qualitative focus groups or one-on-one interviews. For example, in 2008, Daryl Wing Su, again, same guy, and colleagues used a focus group of 13 respondents in one study on Black Americans and 10 in another study on Asian Americans to demonstrate the importance of Su's taxonomy on racial aggressions. In 2011, Su et al. And it seems to be the same people researching these things over and over again. So listen, if they're bringing motive into their first study, they're bringing these motives and these preconceived notions into every subsequent thing. It is technically, if you're looking at it from an academic perspective, as an academic exercise, having bias isn't necessarily bad, but you have to disclose it. You have to disclose in the research, and I'm not reading their research for like their formal papers here, so I don't know if they did this or not, but you have to disclose your bias. You have to do that inner work to say, oh, I have bias in this area, I have bias in this area, I have bias in this area. Listen, I'm a PhD. I did this academic research. I know how to play this game. You also have to disclose different, like what you think is going to come out of this study. You have to disclose any assumptions that you've made. You have to disclose these things up front to keep yourself academically honest. And what you're supposed to do is actually go and proactively look for research that counterbalances whatever bias you may have, that goes against what you believe is going to happen. This is a way to avoid confirmation bias and to keep you intellectually honest. In 2011, Su et al. Interviewed 8 faculty members for a study showing that racial microaggressions directed against the professor or student who was non-white instigated difficult dialogue, and that all 8 faculty members felt internal struggle between their own feelings and professional conduct teaching class. Okay, so we're getting into a new guy now. Daniel Solarzano, I'm sure I'm butchering that name. I'm sorry, Daniel. And his colleagues interviewed 12 Chicano academics in a 1998 study and 34 Blacks in a 2000 study on their experience with racial microaggressions and how critical race theory frames the studies of microaggressions. So basically what they're saying here over and over again, I'm not going to go into all these. Let's look at their conclusion. While such small studies using focus groups or interviews are often necessary when developing a new theory in the social sciences, they are not typically viewed as sufficient evidence for accepted science, much less policy. In the study of microaggressions, there are only a few recent studies using examples of 200 or more and relying on current quantitative methods. Yes. Listen, I did my research, my dissertation research on workplace bullying. I did it using a qualitative style where I interviewed people. I looked for themes in the interviews. I only interviewed like 8 people, so I didn't interview that many people, but I wasn't doing it like focus group style where everyone was in the room all at once. It was over an extended period of time. And then I had to kind of look and see what themes were showing up over and over and over again. And when those themes just kept showing up in every single interview, that's when I kind of had the subjective judgment to say, okay, I've got enough research, I can start drawing some conclusions here because the same themes are showing up over and over and over again. This is completely different from a focus group methodology. One of the reasons that focus group methodology is so difficult to do with a reliable and valid way, and I think they're going to touch on this later, is you have such a small group of people. and they're all listening to what each other are saying. So they're influencing each other throughout the focus group. It does not lead to the most valid, reliable research that you can get. And all of this is you have to put in the GD studies. I cannot emphasize this enough. It is okay to do this stuff. There's methodology behind this stuff. But you have to acknowledge the limitations of your study and that it's not necessarily applicable to a broad range of people. It's just not how it works. Oh, getting a little heated here. Hang on. All right. Bias and opinion conformity when using only focus groups. This is just what I said. Focus group research also runs the risk of inducing bias through peer and authority pressure and conformity of response. We've already covered that. That's a problem with their research methodology. Administration policies as constraint to speak freely. Microaggression focuses on group studies are conducted. Microaggression focus groups studies are conducted overwhelmingly on campus. Roughly 35 focus group interview-based studies from 2007 to 2013 reviewed this for this paper. 27 were conducted on university campuses. As such, the stories, comments, and further contamination of administrative policy are further contaminated by administration policy. At minimum, any student, faculty member, or employee could be turned in or face administrative inquiry or worse should they give an unapproved answer. And listen, I worked in higher education for 10 years. You think that nonsense doesn't happen? Oh, yeah. What are the consequences if a focus group member challenges others? Can a respondent publicly reject the notion, for example, that the phrase America is a melting pot is a case of a microaggression? Can they say that's BS? That's not a microaggression. It's a beautiful aspirational idea. What about a respondent saying that those who get upset over the words and slides should just get over it? There is implicit coercion to give the correct responses. I could not agree with this more. You know, when you work on a college campus, like, I don't work. Part of the reason I stopped working on college campuses is because I got pushed out, man. I'm not one of those people that can keep my mouth shut when I have an opinion about something. You learn right quick that your job is either to conform or you go somewhere else. It is very, very prevalent. So I absolutely agree with that criticism. Problems of reliability of findings. Now, when you do research studies, there are two things that you're really concerned about. I mean, there are lots of things you're concerned about, but two primary things that you really need to consider. Reliability, which is, are your studies going to produce the same result over and over and over and over and over again? And validity. Are you measuring what you think you're measuring, or are you measuring something else? So you have to be consistent and you have to be accurately measuring what you say you are. So this is calling into question reliability. Reliability in the scientific realm refers to the consistency of a measure. That is the extent to which repeated conditions result in the same outcomes. No measure can guarantee identical results time after time, but the APA, the American Educational Research Association, and the National Council on Measurement in Education have established that a reliability standard is a test-retest correlation of 0.7 if a test is said to be scientifically reliable. Okay, so this is why, just as an aside, this is why like a test like the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs, is questionable, because they do not have this test-retest liability correlation specifically on the T and J metric. That thing is like 0.4. So that's why the MBTI gets called into scientific question so much, because of the test-retest correlation. Microaggression research until recently has been a qualitative endeavor. Qualitative research is not necessarily bad. Again, I'm a qualitative researcher, big fan, but it provides problems when you're looking at stuff like this. As such, the APA standards of reliability cannot be met. Only a handful of researchers in the last few years have produced quantitative studies of racial microaggressions with larger samples and tests for reliability. For example, in 2012, Roosevelt University professor of psychology and others developed a racial microaggression scale to measure the phenomenon. University of British Columbia associate professor of psychology and special education and colleagues developed a similar scale in 2011. So scales have been developed, is what they're saying. All three studies had large samples and all created racial ethnic microaggression scales that were found to be reliable. Despite the large samples and statistical tests, University of Nevada, Las Vegas psychologist Gloria Wong and associates observed that the studies were based on self-reporting and recall of past instances, not contemporaneous diary keeping, making it impossible to separate out the immediate versus long-term versus delayed effects of microaggressions. Moreover, they note that a respondent's current psychological state affects recall of past events. This is really important. When we recall things that have happened to us in the past, we have horrible accuracy. The accuracy we have is absolutely horrid. In fact, there have been studies about people really truly believing that they're recalling a real incident that happened. They're making it up. Maybe it happened in a dream. Maybe it was something that was planted to them in therapy. There have been so many studies about the problems of recalling past experiences. So you have to formulate your studies in a different way where it involves contemporaneous diary keeping, so you're writing stuff down when it happens. It's a much more accurate way to do it. Critical race theorists reject such technical concerns, but this lack of evidence of reliability means that Sue's list of racial microaggressions has not been proven. There is no proof that any of these findings are reliable. And listen, I could keep going here. Literally. I guess there's maybe only 3 more. We can maybe just go through them quick. Problem of the replicability of findings. Closely related to the reliability of this issue is replication. Would a different researcher with the same design procedure arrive at the same identical findings? Replication studies, even in mainstream social science, are for the most part not conducted. So they just don't happen. When they are done, half the published studies cannot be replicated. After reviewing the estimated prevalence of each of these flaws and fault lines in biomedical literature, Friedman and his co-authors guessed that fully half of all results rest on shaky ground and might not be replicable in labs. In psychology, the replication failure rates are even higher. In 2015, a study hit the social sciences with all the destructive force of a tsunami. University of Virginia psychology professor and 270 of his colleagues across the nation replicated over 100 published psychology studies. Only 36 of the original 100 got the same results as the original. This is why we always need to be skeptical of research. We always need to question research because you could run the same study in 2 different instances, get completely different results just because something, and listen, I've cited stuff published in an academic journal to kind of give you context, but don't take my word for it. Go do your own research. Go ask questions. Go run your own studies. But just really make sure that you understand that just because you get a result one time does not mean that someone doing exactly the same thing you are would get a different result. We always have to question these things. And when it becomes a problem is when we start making decisions and setting policy and doing trainings and teaching people these things based on things that are not scientifically reliable. Alternative explanations, intensity of racial identification. Let's see, what do they say here? Statistical analysis shows that both greater instances of daily microaggressions and more microaggressions on average, predicted increases in somatic symptoms of negative feelings. Okay. Also raised some interesting paradoxes. The researchers actually introduced a control variable, which is ethnic identification, and found that a major mitigating factor for how strongly the respondent identified as Asian American. The more salient the ethnic identification, the more likely a student would be to report microaggressions. So there are other factors involved here. So, and then they do their conclusion, but listen, I think I've made my point clear on this one. There's a lot of problems with this. There is a lot of problems with this. And listen, here's why I'm actually really fired up about this. Here's why. I told you I did my dissertation about workplace bullying. I told you that this is something I spent 10 years researching. I no longer, well, I won't say I no longer. I very rarely do work these days relating to workplace bullying. You know why? I couldn't get organizations to pay me to do it. Organizations do not want to address the topic of workplace bullying. And this is why I find it particularly offensive when organizations are putting all these resources and trainings into microaggressions, which there is no valid research to show that these are real things. Look at the things that are considered microaggression according to the Pete Buttigieg campaign, or at least I shouldn't blame their campaign, the woman who wrote this survey. Being interrupted or talked over, left off an email chain, not invited to a meeting, idea being ignored, things that every professional has experienced in the course of their career. These are not attributes of workplace bullying. And workplace bullying is something that is consistently ignored in organizations. I can get organizations to pay me to do manager training every day, leadership training every day, coaching every day, mindfulness training to help people personally empower themselves, ding, 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 every single day. They do not want to address issues of workplace bullying. I actually stopped giving talks on the issue of workplace bullying because I got flaming responses in my reviews from conferences that I did it at. Like, how dare you bring up this subject? And we're not really doing this. And, listen, man, workplace bullying is a problem. Nearly 20% of U.S. workers in the workplace and 19% witness it, according to a national survey conducted by the Workplace Bullying Institute. I think that 20% number is low, and I'm going to tell you why. The survey defined workplace bullying as repeated mistreatment of an employee by one or more employees, abusive contact that is threatening, humiliating, or intimidating, work sabotage, or verbal abuse. Although the WBI survey was conducted in 2017, the problem has not abated. In a 2019 Monster.com survey, nearly 94% of people responding reported being bullied in the workplace. And if you look at the data that the Workplace Bullying Institute has, let's see, 63, based on their 20% number, which again I think is low, 63 million U.S. workers affected by workplace bullying. Workplace bullying is not being left off an email chain. It is not being invited to a meeting. It is not having someone interrupt you unless they do it over and over and over again and they're doing it aggressively. There are absolutely ways we can measure this stuff. Listen, where's my form? I'm bouncing all around here. This is a tool that I use to assess workplace bullying. It measures along a variety of different attributes, work-related attributes, personal-related attributes. It looks at how often these things are happening. You're also looking at more severe things like overt aggression, violence, harassment. But listen, there are many factors that go into someone being a target of workplace bullying. It affects a lot of people. And I find it offensive that organizations are putting so much energy into microaggressions that are made up things, that anything in the world can be a microaggression, that have no basis in valid research on the topic, when over 60 million people at a minimum are experiencing workplace bullying in this country. I'm going to give you one more thing to think about why you need to take this problem far more seriously than you take microaggressions. From the Washington Post, I believe. Yep, Washington Post, January 9th, 2020. More Americans are killing themselves at work. Companies grapple with what is appropriate to share and how to support their coworkers. Buried in a report last month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics on operational fatalities was a tragic fact. More people are killing themselves in the workplace than ever before. The number of such suicides for 2018 was 304, a 19% increase over the year before, and the highest number since the Bureau began tracking the data 26 years ago. Where is the outrage over people literally committing suicide at work? I want to scroll down here. Okay, last year, after a Facebook employee jumped to their death from the 4th floor of a company building in Menlo Park, California, his death sparked accusations of harsh work environments for some of the company's foreign employees. This is impacting their Chinese employees. Listen. Actually, we'll go to that in a sec. Let me finish reading this paragraph. The controversy intensified after a coworker of the deceased joined in the criticism and was fired by Facebook shortly after. Let's look at this study a little bit more. A Chinese engineer said he was fired from Facebook after discussing a colleague's death, and it's caused outrage in China. California-based software engineer Yi Yin's story was circulated on WeChat and widely... Chinese social media has erupted in anger over the dismissal of a Chinese engineer from Facebook. Per Bloomberg, Yin said he received an email warning on the same day he attended the memorial of a Facebook colleague who died after jumping out from a window of the company office. Yin's colleague, an adult man, I don't know how to pronounce that name, I'm sorry, jumped from the 4th floor of an office building at Facebook's Menlo Park, California headquarters last month. The man who died was also Chinese, according to Bloomberg. The day after the memorial, which was attended by 400 people, Yin was called into a company meeting. At the meeting, he was told to stop speaking publicly about his colleague's suicide. The company cited privacy concerns. After a second and final warning, the 37-year-old was dismissed Monday, and he has since posted on WeChat that he was forced out for lack of judgment. Not only are people at Facebook committing suicide, but they're firing people who talk about it. And listen, I don't want to get into this like Facebook is evil sort of thing. I don't really think that that's the point I'm trying to make here. But Jesus Christ. The number of other fatalities in the workplace has steadily declined even as workplace suicides have increased. Well, that's good. But still, come on, man. How many people in the last year? 304 people committed suicide at work, according to data a couple weeks ago from the Washington Post. You really want to focus on someone having their feelings hurt because they weren't invited to a meeting? Or they were left off an email? This is absurd. The answer to the problem of microaggressions is, first of all, you have to be really, really specific about what types of things you're going to tolerate and what types of things you aren't. I'm sorry, if you're adding someone was not CC'd on an email to the list, you are missing the boat. Be pragmatic about this. But then you have to ask yourself, what is causing the offense? What is causing the stress? What is causing the interpersonal problem? Is it what the person is saying? Or is it how the receiver is taking it? There are different answers to each problem. But if you're focusing, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. I'm going to be very, very blunt here. If you are focusing energy and attention on microaggressions, and you are not focusing on workplace bullying or the broader health and wellness of your employees, what are you doing? What are you doing? Makes no sense. So that's my very long rant on this topic. I'm sure people will have opinions on it either way, but that's kind of where I stand on things. Again, look, I am very highly, highly supportive of many diversity and inclusion initiatives. I think there are wonderful professionals doing work in this area. I don't think they're all bad. I don't think that this is something that organizations should ignore entirely. That is not the argument I'm making. The argument I am making is that there are many bigger fish to fry. And you need to focus your energy and attention on where you can make the most difference. And you have to be really specific about what is causing the problem and what the solution for it is. I would, every single day, if you are creating a victimhood culture in your organization, you are going to reap what you sow. You get ready for it. Because once you start it, it will not stop. It will be very, very difficult for you to ever create a high-performing, highly resilient team, because what you've done is you've undercut the basic foundation of that concept, which is psychological safety and trust. When you have people that are constantly in a victimhood mindset, they do not trust the people that they work with. This is base level. You need to approach it differently. This is not about slapping the hand of the microaggressors. This is about doing broader training to help people personally empower themselves, develop their ability to communicate, and develop a sense of group cohesion and trust. It is a complicated answer. I'm not going to lay out the solution for it on this video because I already talked for like an hour and I'm losing my voice. But I think you get the point if you've made it this far. Listen, if you have a comment, go ahead, leave it below. Tell me what you think. Agree, disagree, whatever. This is a place to have these conversations and discuss these ideas.